basically, we're all, most of us are recording engineers, and a lot of us have an interest, I'm sure, in how the equipment works, and there might be some brick walls in front of you, or you think there are brick walls to keep you from knowing a bit more about the equipment that you're using beyond the faceplate, and hopefully this panel sort of illuminate a way, or at least a pathway to help you find answers either on your own or with help, and it's not so hard to learn about these sort of things. And I just want to bring up one anecdote that sort of just illustrates how knowing about electronics has helped me as a recording engineer. I went to a fancy studio that I've always wanted to go to, but it had fallen to disrepair over the last decade or so, and that I brought a band that was excited to go there, and I was excited to go there, and we were recording, and sure enough, the fancy Neve console, had all sorts of problems. The patch bay had problems, and the microphones would turn themselves off and on while we were recording. And at the end of the session, I ended up spending about 6 hours troubleshooting and finding ways around these sort of technical issues that that I had seen a lot before, and managed to get a recording out of it. Whereas we were perfectly within our rights to sort of stop and leave, and since it was kind of a mess, try to get our money back. But we made the trip and drove out a day to get to this place and all that sort of stuff. But we managed to make a really decent and really good sounding record, basically working around the problems that the studio had. But I know that if I didn't have this sort of security blanket of knowing how things work and how things connect together, and I wouldn't have been able to help. I wouldn't have been able to record that band, and it wouldn't have worked out in a terrific way. And it would have been a sort of sour memory and a sour experience for them. And most of the stuff that I dealt with in that situation were simple little interconnection problems and things that you shouldn't be held back from trying to solve yourself in those situations. And I just wanted to include people that would are similar frame of mind, where they record bands, and they run studios, and they deal with these sort of obstacles all the time, and just want to share our experience as far as what we would want to do and how we would want to get around these issues, and how it's very easy to learn about these things and take the initiative and find out what you don't have to design a FET front end preamp and do all these sort of things, but it's handy to sort of be able to troubleshoot and limit the loss of your from your studio or your workday and all. But I've got with me Howard Bielderman, who runs a studio in Montreal. He's an engineer and studio owner, and he's been doing that for how long now?
It's 19 years
19
recording.
Years. So yeah, and you've got experience buying used equipment and dealing with all sorts of setting up and building new studios and moving studios and that sort of thing. So you're good. It's a good perspective to have, just from you, what you've had to deal with as far as having things go down on you, and how you dealt with dealing with those repairs, and who you talk to and that sort of those problems. And obviously George has a lot of experience in both recording and developing equipment, and Justin builds equipment, and I don't know, you could tell a little bit more about yourself.
Do you record with it?
I not as much as I used to. I started out with a recording studio, and I think one of the things we're kind of trying to talk about here is I was basically going broke as a studio owner, because in Minneapolis, a very, very competitive studio market. Passing the time waiting for the phone to ring and finding a way to survive, I taught myself how to build stuff and for my own studio, and accidentally discovered that other people would buy it also. So I shifted accidentally from the studio world to the manufacturing world.
And
that's how I got here.
Do you have an interest in going back and recording, or now it's pretty much occupying your time doing manufacturing?
I record my own band primarily, and do some remote stuff, and now I get to choose what I want to record instead of having to take whatever shows up, So it's for fun, basically now, So I'm lucky to be able to actually do it for fun instead of trying to make a living at it. So.
Indeed.
I bet the music sounds better.
I think so.
You can decide what you want to work on.
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of pose a question to all of you and say, like, I'm sure we'd sort of assume that knowing a little bit about electronics is knowing more about everything helps everybody doing lots of things. But I want to sort of just ask you, like, at what do you think is like a good level of, like, knowing how things work and being a working engineer and a producer, and, like, how do they, like what level should you cut it off, or how would you like to sort of?
I'd want to kick this off with, it's a great way in learning how to fix stuff. Learning, being able to, or not being afraid of opening up a box and looking inside and seeing the charred resistor or the suspect connection, going in and pushing things and looking for discontinuities. More so on stuff that's screwing up, so that you can go in and hear how things screw up. I mean, we're all pretty well in touch with the sound of a resistor that goes and starts making noise. And I don't make the sound very well, but the idea that the first time you hear that without any experience in troubleshooting or what goes wrong, you have no idea what's going wrong. The 100th time you hear that, this is that 100 megohm resistor in the front of a KM84 or whatever. You really start being able to narrow down exactly what that sound is. So I'm going to say that, what do you guys think about maintenance and troubleshooting as a entry into that orbit?
Well, I mean, as an economic issue, as a recording engineer or a studio owner, even if you're not going to go out and make a living fixing stuff or building stuff or whatever, you're going to save yourself a lot of money by knowing what needs to be sent out to an expert for repair and what you can fix yourself. There's things I can't fix myself. I mean, I don't know everything.
Just start with plugging, make sure the power is
right.
plugged in.
Yeah. There's certain things that go wrong a lot that tend to be the easiest things to fix. Power supplies and stuff like that. So understanding a basic, and even before that, even before the equipment breaks, understanding how to kind of the technical details of making it work correctly, as far as like reference levels and interfacing and connectivity and things like that, saves you time, saves you money, saves you hassle, and allows you to be more productive and hopefully make a living. So.
Definitely, I've been to a lot of sort of project studios or small studios, and I'm amazed by how many places have things set up in such a way that, like, they're pinning their meters the entire time. Like, they could have the outputs of their rig, their Pro Tools or whatever, just maxed out.
What's the matter with that?
Yeah, exactly. That's the sweet spot, remember?
Why not recalibrate the meters, though?
Yeah, the meters are cool. They just go from the left to the right, and they stay there, and when you're done with work, they go back to the left. That's when you know you're done with the day.
On off.
And, but yeah, it's because I work at a studio. There's, about 70% of the recording in both the studios are on analog tape machines, and we know, we keep track of everything. I make sure the machines are working properly, calibrated, and do it before every session. And it's funny, I'll go to another studio, and they're like, yeah, we got a 24 track, it works, it's great, we use it all the time. And you go there and you put tones on it, and they're all over the place, and they're wiggling all over the place. And I get a sense that that's where this perception of analog sound or the tape sound is coming from, like that vintage warm sound. It's this machine that's like horribly out of spec and hasn't been calibrated in about 2 years. And I mean, that's like the sound. That's what they know is the analog sound, and it's like it's a paradox in a weird way, but it's definitely those type of things you find people who don't know what it's supposed to be when they buy it, and how to connect it to the rest of their studio, how to wire the balance to unbalance to balance to unbalance to balance, these sort of things that just the building blocks of being able to run a session and
along those lines, phase. The first time you run into the pin 2, pin 3 dilemma with old gear, you learn about phase.
think that troubleshooting is definitely an invaluable art when something goes down in a session. You know, at our studio, we rent it out to engineers occasionally. I'll get a call at like 10:30 going, nothing's coming out of the left. What, are you talking about the meters? Are you talking about the left speaker? And just being able to, while the band's paying to be there,
Narrow it down
to, okay, well, actually, it's the power amp in the speaker. And just even something stupid like, well, did you switch the output of the board to the speakers? Does the problem follow the speaker, or does it not follow the speaker? Just that sort of thing. Because I think when a band's paying to be somewhere and something isn't working and everything grinds to a halt, there's this huge slope of frustration that happens. And also knowing when to call it a day and send people home.
Yeah, it's immediately helpful for you to notice that a problem is not going to be fixed that day.
Yep.
And you can just say, okay, we got a break.
Yeah.
And people, the clients you work with, they respond to that sort of, that confidence, and so like, they won't be as frustrated. They'll almost look at it as like a day off in a way.
Right.
Like,
there's nothing more frustrating than when the artist thinks that you don't know what's going on. You know what I mean? There's a problem and you don't know what it is. Whereas if there's a problem, it can be a major problem. It can be a deal breaker for the day. The console is dead, but at least you know it's the console and you know it needs to be fixed. You know you have it under control. As opposed to all hell broke loose. The physics stopped functioning in our studio today or whatever.
I find that fire and smoke is a really good way of the clients understanding something. Like our
so
studio caught
many
fire
stories
last month, and it's sort of like, oh, something's wrong. Back away from the studio.
And actually, in the early days of a piece of equipment's life, there are a lot of serious breakdowns. I remember our first Ampex 124. They hadn't really, if you remember, the 124 had the big heat sink on the tunnel, power transistor mounted around it, and it was a little unreliable. And it had a big fan on it. And this one session, which happened to be a Fleetwood Mac session, the guys are sitting around having done a take, sitting around staring at the ceiling, and the machine, which is rewinding, suddenly a huge fireball comes out of the heatsink into the room with the fan on full speed.
That's awesome.
And the right-hand reel locks the opposite direction, and tape starts spewing onto the floor. Wow, really cool. Now that's really a great thing to help that design team focus on that problem.
Exactly. Especially if it's brand spanking new.
There's been a problem. And that happens all the time to a lesser dramatic extent with new equipment. New equipment's going to screw up.
But are there, I mean, I know I have those moments routinely, and I like telling people all the time, like 80% of the problems in the studio that come up are just connections and, exercising connectors, or, just doing that, like, alleviates the problem. There's countless times where I'll get like a page from Steve from downstairs in the session, and like, it's like, oh, our U48's blown. We got to replace the tube. The tube's going to be about $2,000. Start trying to source that tube out, and I'm like, what? And I'll go down there, and it's, it's just a patch of cables. Like,
right.
Like it's too busy to, go through all the cables and do that stuff. And I start like relaxing a little more and that sort of thing. And,
right.
But I'm sure we've all, in session, like I don't get like upset about anything until the third tier of problem solving has been tried. And
right.
But like, is that sort of like a scenario you guys go through routinely as well? Just because things happen, you use old equipment,
if you can learn to work through in troubleshooting, work through operator error and connectivity, you'll save 95% of the repair work. You know what I mean? And if you can figure out how to deal with power supplies, that's the other 50%. So you'll very rarely need to hire anybody.
The other real good thing to have is a reliable report on what led up to the problem, what was turned on when the problem happened. And there's always a Val Gray story to cover an idiotic situation. But I remember Steve Waldman walking into the control room on Ivar, and Val had heard a pop in the right-hand speaker. And his first motivation is, well, you got to change the speaker.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Is there a level of it's kind of hard for working engineers out there and producers to sort of try to shoehorn some time to do something that they don't feel like they're really, it's like trying to learn French, But
Mon Dieu, Greg.
but seriously, like
Monsieur.
it's something that they
Uncle
can't.
Fred running.
They
I
don't
love
perceive a
bibliotech.
quick sort of reward for
It
doing-
seems like learning about this stuff is a very long process, and
Yeah.
you are never going to get anywhere. And there's
you can sort of baby step your way through it
Right.
and find things that you need or deal with all the time and try to learn about Ohm's law and these sort of simpler sort of aspects of things that can definitely help you get into it. But it does seem like you have to find. It seems like to people you have to find time to learn this stuff, and I don't want to deal with that. I've got a girlfriend, and I got
Right.
That's the first thing you go.
yeah. Seriously.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like I read things all the time that are over my head, and it's like, but I understand a little bit of it, and then that helps me go do some stuff, and I come back and I read it again. It's like, oh, now I understand the other part because I did something,
But that's a good point. You remember what you read,
And then you read
run
it
into
again.
that.
You know.
And if you run into that situation, maybe you recognize
Right.
it.
But there's probably a few basic things that I think that everyone here should learn if you don't already know them, so that you can do some things. I mean, if you don't know Ohm's law, that's the first thing. I mean, it's like that's the basic thing. It's like if you don't know what the word balanced really means and what ground really means, you know what I mean? If you don't understand reference levels and how decibels full scale coming out of your computer compares to dBu or dBm going into your meters or your tape deck or whatever, you're going to have some
And
problems.
for that matter, understand a basic signal path.
Right.
Understanding
Signal
basic
flow.
topology.
Yeah.
And what would you refer people to, like, as far as like just getting this breakdown? Because I remember there's that Yamaha sound reinforcement handbook book that was like you bought at Guitar Center maybe or something like that, but it had all it was very layman's terms and it had everything sort of in there like broken down.
And I've never had that, but I've found some really good resources that I've learned a lot from. One of them sitting right back there. If there's a smart nerd in your town that you can buy beer and bring it over and let him and he'll teach you some stuff, that helps. But there's a few websites, Jensen Transformers websites has tons of really cool stuff. Rain Corporation has some really cool information. Wikipedia works pretty well, I mean, we're lucky that we have these things and everything in the world is in there and you can find it, you know what I mean?
But then there's like too much stuff.
It
Like we
can be
talked about
overwhelming.
this earlier, the Wikipedia entry for decibel, you have about like 17 different decibel standards that
And you have some heavy math that can be kind of intimidating, and you don't really need it to be that intimidating. But the user and repair manual for Tascam analog tape recorders are fantastic. Everybody go buy a Tascam tape deck
MS-16.
used and make sure it comes with a manual and read that because it's got.
That's where I first learned about decibels and that it's crazy. It's like I have like a lot of respect for that company in the 80s just because they sent all that stuff out knowing the people that were going to be, and they also gave you recommendations to avoid the pitfalls of their crappy equipment sometimes. It's
Right.
All right, don't if you're not going to use REQ, don't plug into the line in, plug into the insert return because it'll be lower noise and this. It's like, wow, you're advising how to work around your stuff. It's pretty, but yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know.
Just to take a step back, I can't tell you the elation I felt when I learned how to solder my own cables.
Yeah.
Even that was liberating.
Yeah.
On that level, and I think any incremental step up you can do with knowledge or learning how to swap an IC chip, just pry it out of its socket and put in a new one is valuable.
Right. Maybe we take a minute to find out what these people know already and want to know more about.
Yeah. Are you guys tinkerers or are you guys sort of like engineers
or gear designers?
Gear designers, raise your hands.
There you go. But sorry, go ahead.
I can't speak for the group's knowledge, but something that seems to be a little bit of an art that I haven't figured out yet and definitely lowers the boundaries of tinkering is figuring out when you can substitute a found transformer instead of buying the $65 transformer that the schematic calls for. Likewise, that you have a lot of flexibility if you can work with.
Are you talking about a power transformer?
Output transformer, I'm thinking of. But
Wow.
But you're talking about understanding data sheets is what you're talking
Wow.
about,
Or
specifications.
even
And,
like think of a regulator in a power supply.
Right,
It's
comparing
say, oh,
parts
it's a
and
regulator.
sure.
Well, all I know is the number that's on the schematic, and I know how to buy that. But if it's expensive,
Or if it's out of stock, or
Right.
you don't
yeah,
have
so
it.
this seems like
So you download the data sheet and you read it, and you and a lot of the numbers on you have two different similar parts, and you're comparing them, and a lot of the details will be identical, and then you find the ones that aren't, and you're like, oh, is that an important thing? And then you know what I mean. So you decide you need to read and learn what that what does slew rate mean for this op amp, and if they're both identical, you don't really need to know what it means because you don't get to choose. You know what I mean? But by comparing data sheets, you quickly start to get a sense of what's important and what isn't, because there's things that they really try to brag about having good specifications.
Well, and your example with the regulator is a little tough, because although you can get the power dissipation down, how do you know if that dissipation of the replacement chip or the dissipation limit is going to work in your circuit? Because it's not like, I mean, I guess you could compare two parts.
Right.
But there are also weird things like secondary breakdown in the pass transistor in a regulator, and it's very hard to see that. You have to look at the safe operating area curve and sort of compare
Right.
it. It really gets geeky very fast.
But your first thing was like transformers. It's like transformers are complicated, and I'm not a transformer designer, and there's a lot of issues. Like I can't tell you how to build them, but I can tell you how to look at the data sheets or listen to them and say, I mean, there's some basic things. There's will it physically fit in your box? There's what kind of maximum signal level can it take before you get to a certain degree of distortion. There's frequency response, phase response, and of course ratios. Turns ratios. It's like if you don't have the right turns ratio, it's not going to do the job that you're trying to get done. So that once you get those basic, and this is true about all parts or anything that you're, when you're shopping for speakers, even, you read you compare the things and you find out what's important to you, and eventually you start, because until you understand the data, you're looking at two identical things as far as your perception. You know what I mean?
But it's like what I'm sorry. No, go ahead. It's like what you said about looking at the Tascam manual. We all stand on the shoulders of giants and old school designers, and studying what they did is the most valuable resource you could imagine.
Sure.
And to the extent that you can find, and there's sites with schematics up these days, to the extent that you can, dig into your equipment and go find the schematic to it, there's a lot to learn.
Yeah. I before I really knew a lot about electronics, I would spend a lot of time looking at schematics of gear that either I wished I could afford or gear that I had that I bought off eBay, but it doesn't work. But and for a long time it didn't make any sense. But you try to follow signal flow, and you get better at it the more you stare at schematics. And once you start to understand, the signal goes in here and comes out there, and it has to pass through one of these lines. You figure out which ones are power and which ones are ground and which ones have audio on them, and you know what I mean?
And then you'll run into, in tube topologies, I mean, it came up in tubes, which is why I hate them. In tube topologies, you'll stumble across just the weirdest configuration. Remember the output stage of the Ampex MX35 mixer was this weird cascode output stage in this weird configuration. I had no idea.
Stare at it for a long time
Stare
before
it
it
for a
starts to make any sense.
Why the hell did they do that?
You
It
read
turned out
somebody
it was a
else's
current
description,
source.
right.
Yeah, it's constant current source.
Read somebody else's description of why it works. It still doesn't make any sense. You
Yeah.
go back and look at it, and now it starts to make
And that kind of aha moment
It's
really
very
sticks
incremental.
with you. Yeah.
Your question brings up this, and we'll take your question after. We have our studio
Maybe.
has two. We have two technicians in the basement, and it's funny because one of them he's old school, and one of them is a young guy who just got out of school.
New
And
school.
the old school guy, you bring him something, these resistors, and he's got a shop of junk basically, and he'll rummage through something, and say, oh, this will work, and throw it in, and then the spec will be completely different. And so there's that sort of moment of tension. Whereas the other guy, the young guy, was like, okay, I'll order this. It'll take 2 weeks. We'll get here. And so just sort of to have the knowledge of like when you want to preserve exactly what the designer used, and when you do have the latitude to.
And let's go a step farther. When you realize the designer is up, maybe with power dissipation in a resistor, and they've designed in a 1/4 watt resistor. It's
On the other hand,
been known to happen.
there is a lot of second guessing of designers. People who want to go in and mod their circuits and like, oh, we can take out all these capacitors and like we were saying earlier, the designer wouldn't have paid money for that capacitor if it didn't need to be there for the most part. You might be able to get a better one today.
I don't know about that.
Not always. I know. But for example, I mean, if someone wants to pay me to second guess your designs and change it, I'll probably
Perfectly okay with me.
I might make it better. It might make it worse. I might make it start on fire. Who knows? But
But it would be different.
Yes, different.
there was a guy back there that had
Yeah,
a.
I would say that in addition to the internet, which has actually turned out to be a fairly decent resource, if anybody's really interested, they need to get a copy of the Audio Engineer's Handbook by Tremaine and just read it start to finish several times.
Yeah.
Every time you sit down and have a bowl of cereal, read the book.
The first time you read it, you'll drool on yourself while you're like, what? But
Well,
after a while.
And for ICs, Audio Op Amp Cookbook, or
Yeah,
is that Walt Jung's original
There's
book?
a
Yeah.
couple of key books you need to just sit down and read over and over and over and over.
Definitely the Audiocyclopedia. Yeah, it's something I grab every.
That's it,
the-
encyclopedia.
Yeah.
And the Art of Electronics,
Right.
which like a friend recommended to me, and like I haven't read the whole thing. I've just sort of picked little parts when I see something. I'm like, whoa, why is it happening this shape?
Right.
I'll like look for
But-
that shape in the book.
But you don't have to jump into the deep end of the pool. I mean, there's
yeah,
that's some pretty in-depth stuff, and it can be intimidating, especially if you. I mean, like personally, I really am into math. I enjoy math, but I know a lot of people aren't, and if you start reading something and you get into some heavy duty, like there's some calculus going on in there or something, you're just like, but you could start with the easy stuff. I mean, start with Ohm's law.
But there are tools to really help you out. If you don't want to learn math, and I didn't, and finally had to, get MATLAB. Get the student version of MATLAB and lay out your circuits in MATLAB before you blow them up on a bench. And just see what works, and it gives you, I mean, there are tools that give you basic concepts, like filter design. Filter design is a pain in the if you have something like MATLAB where you can go in and see what changing things actually does to a filter, I find it very useful. I wish I'd had it as a tool when I was coming up.
What was the first thing that kind of got your eyes open that you could sort of do this sort of thing? I know that my interest in this field started when I was around nice equipment, and I saw that there's the Audio Express or one of those magazines, and they have a little kit, or the guy was like, I'm building a power amp with this one obscure part, and like the one article I saw was like, build your own mic preamp with this Burr Brown chip, and it was like, that's really simple. It's kind of like that Radio Shack kit I put together a long time ago, and I just bought the parts and hacked it together, and I had a functioning mic preamp that sort of worked, and it was like a result that only cost me $120, and something I could use in my personal studio or whatnot. And it's sort of just these bells went off in my head, and I thought well, I can look at all these other schematics and create these things. I mean, that's what sort of sparked my interest into doing this sort of stuff, and that was before I was even trying to fix anything. That came later.
Yeah.
But what was the entry?
I had my growing up with a very nervous Jewish mother. I remember.
But then you repeat yourself.
When I was like 13, having my integrated receiver, the whole left channel didn't work. And so I took a screwdriver and started opening it. My mother caught me, opening this. Just, don't do that, you'll electrocute yourself. And big sticker, no user serviceable parts inside. And then sneaking it into the basement and unscrewing it and finding out there was a little fuse that blew. And going to Radio Shack on my bicycle, getting a fuse, putting it in, and now it worked. And putting it back together and just feeling a sort of pride and just get over the nervousness of. I mean, also you can do a lot of stupid things. You can. If you don't, you can kill yourself.
You can take apart a lot of stuff and never get it back together.
Oh yeah, I was great at that when I was little.
Oh, when I was a kid, I would always take stuff apart and very rarely got anything back together.
Yeah. And when you did, there was always that screw left.
Right, exactly. How many screws are left? But
I shouldn't have a bag of screws.
Right.
Dad, don't drive.
I think for me, when I figured out that I had to kind of figure out how to do some of this stuff, I was always interested and always kind of technical in doing stuff, but I learned how to record at my college radio station. The University of Minnesota has this really nice studio with a Neve console and these old Altec tube mics and RCA ribbon mics and all this great stuff, and it was amazing, and I got to record hundreds and hundreds of bands, good bands, live on the air and learn all this stuff. But there was no budget, even though obviously there was at one time because we had all this stuff. But the maintenance engineer was an alcoholic and like just nothing. You could pester somebody forever to like fix the headphone jack on the box or whatever, and it was never going to happen. So they gave me keys, so I would just go in there at night and make records and fix the crap that was not working for me. And it's like instead of asking permission or asking for help, it just like left everybody else out of the loop and.
Yeah, because no one else is going to do it anyway.
Exactly.
It's
lost.
lost.
You just basically decide, I'm going to do this.
I think that our studio is only analog, and I think sort of built into recording on tape and having to bias your machine before each session is this culture of tinkering and being more connected with your equipment. That's just an aside, unless someone wants to pick that up.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to touch on. I was thinking engineers and people out there making records, it seems like there's a less scientific-y nature to it nowadays. It's
How many people here wear a white lab coat while they're recording?
I have a white lab coat.
I'm sure you do, I bet.
Our technician was working on this Chilton console, and some other studio bought it, and all the faders, the volume went from quiet to loudest. So they were reversed, and so his job was to flip them around. And apparently the BBC did that because the lab coat, the engineers' lab coats, they figured if the lab coat caught the fader and it went down, the signal would go up, but the compressor would catch it and go down. Whereas if the signal went off and the announcer disappeared, it would be a big deal.
Makes sense.
That's my lab coat story.
My story about getting into business is I grew up down the street from Dean Jensen, and we got into photography, an amateur radio, he was K3JNS, and a couple friends of ours were with a recording studio in town, a 2-track recording studio, did mostly commercials, but they also had the deal to broadcast or do the remote pickup for the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra at the Lyric, the old Lyric. And so one of our gigs was, and this was not as cool as it sounds, to lug a 351 down to the Lyric, and 351 down to the Lyric just to use it as a line driver in front of an Ampex mixer to do the broadcast every Tuesday night. So we had the cool idea of building a line driver, from scratch. And I worked for Curtis Marshall, who was Stephen Sancoy's, Stephen Marshall's father. And he had a bunch of transformers, because back at that time there was nothing but surplus out there. It was so cool, going to the surplus yards, which, we don't have that too much anymore, but just going to the surplus yards and picking up diamonds in the rough. It was just great and paying nothing for them. And we slammed together a tube line driver, and it didn't work very well. And we wanted to find out why, and that kind of got both of us launched. We used it anyway, but it was kind of a cool project, and it saved a lot of people's backs because they didn't have to lug a 351 down.
I mean, it does seem like that. The first thing you do, you build it and it kind of works, or there's this thing that's wrong, and either you get advice or you read something and like you find out you routed your mic level signal right next to the power in, and the AC coming in, and you get a bunch of noise, and then you're like, oh, you're supposed to keep those really close to the audio circuit and like the feedback loop of this amplifier really close to this, and then you solve that problem and you get all excited, and there you go.
Well, that leads to another subject, and I think it's important to state that as designers, it's really tough to know when to stop, because something is always wrong with it.
Right.
There's something you can always do a little bit better. There's a transformer that you can't quite null out the 60 hertz in by orienting. There's always something wrong. What's the standard that we apply to ourselves when to throw it in the river to get it out there? That's a good point. And by the way, a lot of times is when it gets out there, you guys can make it better. By the way.
Yeah, I do. I have a friend in Chicago who can't or get off the pot with his stuff. He over designs things, and he lets those little things get in the way of like just give it to the dude, sell it.
Yeah,
it's a great thing. It's already being used for 5 years. Just make 100 of them and sell them. And it's like, yeah, but I don't like the way every 15 times, you know, like the pot doesn't really like the tracking on it's not perfect on the last little percent. It's like no one cares. Just
Right.
Tracking on a pot?
like, you know.
Surely you just.
Any of other people who just make stuff and throw it out there, you know, like you can buy a pot, you know, the like the A Designs Addy is just this knob that just turns stuff down. It's like, it's very imperfect, but it gets the job done.
Yeah.
And
Right.
people don't have time to worry about whether it's perfect or not. It's like
Right.
it works, it gets the job done, and that's all there is to it, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And in the heat of the session, you're not really, you know, it's like, whoa, did you notice that pot, you know, if you turned it over here, it doesn't really go up animoore?
But now, wait a second. Speaking to that, recently somebody was running Pro Tools, and they turned a pen pot from the center out to the right, and noticed it was much louder. And it turns out Pro Tools has always had the wrong law on their stereo mixer. It's 2.5 dB down the middle, which we learned at the very beginning. It's 3 dB down. You know, it's a law.
They also have annoying output amplifiers.
Well, there's a lot of annoying things, but we shouldn't go off there.
Yeah.
That's,
But, I mean,
that's a different panel.
But the idea that these aha moments come at you all the time, and as guys who can reach into equipment with old analog equipment, we could get in and fix it.
Sometimes.
No, but I mean a lot of
Yeah.
times. You'd want to.
You want to. You definitely want to.
At your level as a gear manufacturer, how common is it to release a box and then release a revision of it under the same model number? And then when do you feel the
Constantly.
need to
Never happens, right?
Never happens.
Constantly.
Yeah, never happens.
Never happens. All too often. And it's a good reason not to release any new product. You really learn in the early days what you got wrong, and I'm proud to be a part of a team that really responds very, very quickly to problems. You know, we are going to respond quickly and aggressively. We're not building the stuff in China, Chino, not China, Chino, and to get it right very quickly. You know, and also to help fix those things that have gone out and get those
Right.
out too.
That's the main thing. You have to support what you put out there. You know?
Gotta support what
I mean, I don't have the reputation or the budget that he has, I think.
I don't have any
And,
budget.
well, imagine less than that then. And I revise my stuff constantly, you know. It's like you make it work well enough that it's going to satisfy the person you're selling it to, and hopefully the first few modules are going out to people you know. You know? But, you know, and of course, if it comes back, you have to support it. But then, you know, you figure out, you know, I build 25 or something, and then the next 25, or then, you know, I can fix all those things, and now it's refined enough that I feel comfortable making 50 or 100. You
Well,
know?
now this brings up the staggering subject of things going obsolete, of source parts going obsolete, which happens to us 2 or 3 times a year on a part that we consider critical. That a transistor, a discrete transistor, nobody knows from discrete transistors anymore, and it's a game going out there with these services that have allegedly exact replacements that are nothing like
Right.
what are in your gear, and trying to make that right, and move that design along.
Or trying to find the broker that's got 700 of them in, you know, Taiwan or something, or
And is
Thailand.
willing to ship them over, and,
Yeah.
and will guarantee you that it's close enough that part, and you don't get some weird diode in.
It is funny how you do play that game. You're sort of like, it's almost like forces of nature that you're just sort of like, you're fishing, and it's like, oh, you know, hopefully this year they don't cancel the one essential thing of my product that I make my life's earnings on.
And they will.
Yeah.
And you
Right.
have to figure out how to design around it.
You have to just like sort of like go with those waves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of along the lines of the design and especially replacement parts and stuff, ROHS, how much does that affect you guys?
I was just about to say that, because
Parts are dying left and right now.
I can't begin to tell you how devastated we were when we read it, and we've been working with it, and we're still working with it. We've tried any number of tacks. We actually made an application to the office in Belgium for a variation, or an exemption, whatever they call it. I forgot what it's called.
exemption.
Because we can't imagine a waste dump filling up with 8200s.
Right.
I mean, it probably isn't going to happen. And there are any number of products like that we think should have individual examination. We're trying to be compliant, but there are a couple things that are not exactly compliant.
We're completely compliant now, but and now I think it's not that big a deal because as I design new stuff, you just pick parts.
Yeah.
You know, you start, but the transition was really tough because, for example, you know, so the thing went into force July 2006. Well, Gray Hill, who makes the really nice switches we like to use, decided that they ought to start making compliant switches by July 2006. And I have to ship product with it in there already, and I have to get it through a supply chain that has long lead times. So there was a while there where I didn't have any compliant switches, and what are you going to do?
You did the same thing we did.
Yeah, which is, we got on the phone with our European dealers and said, I'm sorry, we can't take your money this month. No. No, I'm kidding. Yes, you did.
Well, that was a bitch.
But now it's pretty much a done deal. You know, I mean,
But are you seeing stuff coming back?
no. There are companies way more important than mine with a lot more jobs and a lot more money riding on it. You know, I mean, who have had to figure out what formulation of lead-free solder is going to work. And you know, I use SAC 305 and it works and it's great. You know, it's when you're doing hand assembly and you look at a solder joint and it looks all gray, it looks like a bad solder joint, and you're like, that's a bad solder joint, and you resolder it 8 or 9 times, and eventually you realize it's not a bad solder joint, it just looks different, you know. And you know, for people who are doing stuff at home or recreationally or working on your own stuff, there's no need to worry about it at all. But for manufacturing, it's really fine. It's
And
no
we're
big deal.
still finding better solders. We were in Japan in February and going to the Sanken factory. They had a cool new solder,
I've read about
low
some
temperature
stuff.
solder, and it was RoHS compliant, and you know, we're tracking it down. It's expensive, so I don't know whether we want to go right into it.
Mhm.
But we're finding out ways around it.
Yeah.
But what RoHS was trying to address was, you know, VDUs with huge amounts of lead in the
Mhm.
tubes and in the on the circuit boards, and dumps just filling up with,
Right.
with these. And
Although,
nobody trying to repurpose.
you know, they got the lead out of the you know, ICs, but the batteries are exempt, so that doesn't make any sense. You got 4 pounds of lead in the battery, but you got rid of the 3 grams in the ICs. But
Wow.
you know, it's really not that big a deal. The transition was the hard part because a lot of parts went obsolete. You know, there's a lot of chips that were like, a lot of companies were just like, you know, we're not going to make a new one of those. You know, for the numbers that we're selling for that piddly little audio market. You know, it's like.
Yeah, what's going to happen when
If you can
all
use-
those little chips go away? Like, and
You're going to learn how to design with parts that are also used in computers and cell phones. That's what.
Well, but linear transistors are a problem.
Yeah.
And I can only hope that somebody will stay in the business that, or that will find a foundry that can do chips for us.
I think linearity will be obsolete. So.
Maybe. Everything binary. You know, but
Have you
there's
listened to
always,
a record?
there's always going to be a linear part. Even in the input, you know, Ed Meitner still makes converters, and he has a linear part on the input because he makes his own comparator, his input comparator. There's going to be a linear part. In a digital microphone, there's going to be
Sure.
a FET right up front.
And there's businesses popping up to take advantage of the fact that we need stuff that Texas Instruments isn't going to make. You know, linear systems making, you know, a replacement for the 2SK170. That corporation making good audio chips specifically for the audio market. You know, it's
Or analog devices. You know, there's
Analog
still a bunch of
devices,
analog
yeah.
devices stuff out there. And it's pretty well supported.
it's just a matter of
around.
just a matter of designing with the parts that are going to continue to be available.
Yeah.
Replacing parts on your old broken gear is another story.
Well, and that's when it comes to the art of figuring out if you can get away with
What you can use instead.
you know, a
Yeah.
daughter board, and
Mhm.
it's pretty tricky if you have an LF351, and that goes out, and you know, you fed input op amps or bi-fed input op amps or whatever input, fed input op amps don't draw any input current, so you've got to get something in there that and maybe it's bipolar input, so you've really got to do some redesign.
Mhm.
That gets a little tricky.
How many people have like some level of electronics education, like even just self-taught in here? And then how many people,
How many people
don't have any, like,
Idea what we're talking about.
kind of curious about it but don't have any idea? Okay, well that's good.
Good.
Well, it's sort of it's an interesting thing. I've noticed that a lot more people are, when they're working and recording, back to recording music and everything. Like when they're working, their work method is more centered around, computers and, dealing with a couple of outboard gear at a time and microphones. And it's not so much it's sort of centered around a screen, and you sort of look at that, and you're dealing, 80% of your energy is what you do on the screen, and it's a little less physics and mics in the room and like analog signals going through analog gear. And I'm wondering, do you guys feel that like that culture is leading to emphasis less of an emphasis on being more scientific or being more?
Because he's going the other way.
Yeah,
I'd say no, but what do you guys think?
I hate the idea that people stare on the screen and try to eyeball music, and we're really trying to get back to performance. So
Sure.
I want to feel something in the music. That's 99% of the
I think, I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but I think I've found myself, I mean, I do everything. I'll set up the mics, I'll bias the tape machine, and I'll give the singer some feedback. And I find there's always a balance between right brain and left brain kind of stuff. Listening to a vocal take and thinking, well, she should back off the mic a bit, or there's not enough emotion in it, versus I should really change the impedance on the mic preamp. And that's sort of always balancing those things.
Right.
In the middle of a recording where you might have some from before and some from after, you really have to make a decision.
But
From
talking to people online and here and my customers and stuff, I think actually the opposite is happening, because now that a lot of people don't have to worry about calibrating the tape deck, and the analog signal path has gotten so much shorter that you can kind of understand it now. And I think that is largely responsible for what I see as kind of an explosion of people wanting to build their own stuff and get in and tinker with gear and modifications and, getting some vintage modules and racking them up and all this stuff. And because it's become this smaller nugget that you can kind of digest. You can, if you just have a mic preamp and a compressor and an A to D converter, it's like you can kind of get your head around that. You know what I mean? And I think that's why so many people are building kits now and showing up here and learning. And there might be a lot of knowledge that's lost because it's not needed anymore for the general public or for the average recordist. But then what's left is something that can actually be kind of understood.
Good point.
How do you guys think if let's say if you're a person who does have like a curiosity and they're moving and they're working a lot and they're doing these things, I'm sort of rehashing the education question, how would that person go about just like just exploring their curiosity for this sort of thing? And they obviously
Take shit apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends what you're curious about, really.
Exactly.
I mean,
It's like you can't build motivation for something that you don't really want to do. So.
Right.
But there's no bigger again, going back to that point, there's no bigger motivation than something that doesn't work and you need it to work.
Right.
Yeah, I was saying yesterday at our panel that in our studio, it's so funny how like where the line is about when you have to send something for servicing. Because for us, that knob's a little crackly. We'll live with it. Well, those two buttons don't work. Well, how often do we use those two buttons?
Right.
Okay, that whole left channel doesn't work. Well, we'll use it as a mono unit. Okay, it doesn't power up.
Right.
Okay, we're going to fix it. And that's sort of like making those decisions.
When it doesn't power up, that's the easiest thing to fix.
Yeah.
I love those ones. I hate the thing where over the
kinda
course
works.
of a 12-hour day, there's a in the sound.
1 second.
Yeah,
12-hour day,
exactly,
but-
exactly.
And invariably happens at a really sensitive time.
Exactly.
Right, of course.
And then,
That's
of
the
course,
tough
you're
part.
hearing it where it's not like, did that just happen again? Didn't wait and rewind and listen to it again. No, it's not. It's like, what are you listening for? It's like, did I screw that up? No, you didn't screw anything up. I'm just seeing if there's a noise there. What kind of noise? Don't worry about it.
Is there a noise?
I find that bands managers and electrical equipment don't usually go well together. Our managers come, what? It was working 5 minutes ago.
Je sais quoi.
You know what area really interests me? I don't know if this is if I'm derailing the train a bit, but as a person who's been buying equipment, I guess buying studio equipment since I was 22 or 23, not knowing anything, just being able to open something up and look at it and say, yeah, that's worth $700 or $1,000, or just demystifying this whole. Remember, in the mid '90s, everyone had a tube mic or a tube something, and 99% of the tubes weren't doing anything, or there was a single tube and a chip before it doing the amplification. And just demystifying that sort of thing. Or I mean, Greg was at our studio. I bought this box for $700, and he said, "Can I open it up?" He opened it up. He's like, "Yeah, this is about $65 of parts at Radio Shack."
Right.
You know. And,
Well, there's one thing you had to buy.
Yeah, one. But just knowing whether what you're buying is worth. I mean, okay, obviously there's two sides to it, because one, the way something sounds could be its worth, but also just knowing if it's something that's well built, something that's built with quality components, I think is pretty valuable.
Right.
Or that there's something in there. I remember the first time opening up the Alesis Masterlink, which was designed by my ex-chief engineer, Alan Meyer. Opening up the Masterlink, and there's nothing inside. It was like when I was a kid opening up a Muntz TV. Somehow Madman Muntz was able to make TVs with nothing inside.
Right.
There was a small child in our Masterlink, I think.
That was like a promotional thing that really went out. But yeah, that's totally.
It's especially important when you're comparing two pieces of gear, because it's like, these two compressors are, the same price. I like the way they both sound, but is this one going to last? And is it worth the money? You know what I mean? Or this one's $300 cheaper. Why? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Why does this cost half as much as this one? You open it up, and you sometimes you compare them, and you go, oh, because these guys are making more money. And, and other times it's like, oh, this one's cheaper because they used really crappy parts, and actually they're the ones making more money.
Well, a lot of times you'll see more gold. You'll see gold on the Canons, or the XLRs, rather.
Sometimes you'll just see gold printing on the capacitors.
But yeah, that's a good point, though. It's there are, especially when there are millions of mic preamps out there, like, what differentiates all these preamps use, like, they're using the same transformer, they have like a weird hybrid op amp or a discrete op amp in there, and then they have like, straight up output stage, like there's a meter on this one and not on this one. What's the difference? It's
right.
And then, at that point you can see the build quality and the history and like the reputation of like support and all that, and there's definitely, a great sounding mic preamp that kind of looks like pretty well made, but like you find out they're not really too into the preamp. They got that's like one of 20 things they make, and like that's a good money maker. And then there's a
toss-off design.
Yeah, and then there's another preamp that's like that's the one of two things this other manufacturer makes, and he's like it's a passion of that person, and it's he's been doing it for 20 years, and like. Everything's rock solid, and you never hear bad things about it. And like, both sound pretty okay, but this one, the better reputation one, might be a little more expensive. And you sort of make the decisions even before looking inside. And if if you have the privilege of being able to look inside, you can definitely tell when there's Tinker Toy parts inside.
Right. And not everyone's going to come to the same conclusion either. I mean, you can compare the vintage knockoff that's handmade meticulously in Iowa. That costs 3 times as much as the knockoff of that's made in China,
Yeah.
And some people might say, this one's cheaper. It's not, the parts aren't as nice, and I don't care where it's made, and I'm going to save some money. And other people are going to say, this one's going to last a little longer. I like the fact that the money's going to Iowa instead of China. And I have my preferences, and other people might disagree. But knowing what is going on.
Yeah.
Helps you make your own decision.
And then there's the issue of, we're a discrete company. We've always been discrete. The issue of IC versus discrete. And I will be the first to admit that the qualities are merging, that they're getting closer. You can get a lot out of the chip these days. But to us, you can still get an incremental improvement with discrete. So if you look at one of our units, it's and I'm not here to brag, but there are other people that build discrete. You guys have some. But I mean, you go in and you see individual transistors instead of just one IC and a couple of Japanese parts around. There's a big difference.
Yes, and also
it can be.
Back to the
knowing when to use it and when not to use it is the thing. But as someone who's just looking at someone else's design, unless you want to reverse engineer the entire thing to decide whether or not they made the right decisions, at some point you got to trust somebody.
Yeah.
And as a buyer of gear, I would like to believe that people are acting in good faith.
Right.
But your interaction, a piece of equipment, your first level of interaction is their advertising.
Right.
And advertising budgets sometimes rival development budgets.
Sure.
And then your second connection with something is to kick the tires. And
And the third is to come down here and talk to the manufacturer.
Well, let me take this opportunity to rail at Behringer, because this is a company that does nothing in the way of original design or any kind of engineering. They steal pretty much everything and are completely upfront about it. It's completely upfront, and I find it appalling that any of us would buy Behringer. But then there's somebody that just doesn't have any money and needs something, so maybe.
And there's churches, and
Yeah.
people don't care, and like,
Who-
oh, this thing's $400 cheaper.
Yeah.
But yeah, a part of the first kit mic preamp thing I built was like a switch gain, and like, oh, I bought this switch, and then sure enough, like it was a plastic piece of crap switch. It was sealed like make before break switch, and I was like, oh yeah, that's the one I need. Yeah, it did have gold contacts, and just tightening the nut caused it to be a little weird, and like after a few months, like it was intermittent. You had to shake it, and that was like just something that bothered me, and then I realized I should buy nicer switches, and then no, it was something out of Mauser. I don't even remember, but I remember seeing like the style switch, and then I went to one of these conventions, AES or someplace, and they had like some guy had his like $4,000 mic preamp out, and and EQ, and there were those switches in there. I'm like, no way. It's like I'm not touching that with like a stick. I'm like.
But Greg, that's the problem even for petite designers as well. The stuff when you understand it and you look at it, like I'm not going to bring up any names, but there's a very big petite manufacturer here in the US that in their literature states it's an Elmer switch and it's an Alpha Japan rotary switch that is a Lawland knockoff. I mean, Lawland's actually made in London. The parts are a real Lawland switch is actually better than the Alpha knockoff. But you have guys saying it's a European-made switch in their literature, and it's a cheap $5 switch with mouse. So it's not a $25, $50 switch that it should be.
Yeah.
I guess, you're saying like the first impression you get of somebody is their advertising, and if they're going to flat out lie, it's kind of tough then.
Screen, yeah.
But a lot of times you can learn a lot from just how they phrase things. Like say for example you're shopping for speakers and you compare two sets of speakers, and one of them the data sheet says 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and the other one says 30 hertz to 18 kilohertz plus or minus 2 decibels, 3 decibels or whatever. Which one's better? Like these guys didn't give you a reference of. They're the amount of detail that people are willing to go into. I think oftentimes tells you how conscientious they are, and you can learn something from that.
I teach these sound workshops, these weekend sound workshops at our studio for people who are basically just recording at home. And part of the goal was that just to say, here's a cell sheet for a microphone. It would be really great if you knew what this graph, and this measurement meant. Mm-hmm. And if you do, and you know what, and you can read 6 of them, it might help you use the figure of 8 mic for that application.
Sure.
Because it would reject the body of the guitar, something like that.
Funnily enough, the figure or the data that I always wanted out of microphones, I could never get. And that figure is the variation in between microphones, which is more important now that we have a lot of ribbons, because they vary more, it seems to me, than others. So that's the spec that I want, and it's the last spec I'll get out of them.
But there's one thing, there's one thing that you see varying between companies. You buy a Shure microphone, and the graph is printed by in glossy. It's the same one.
Better microphones are. Yeah.
But it's a glossy print they throw the same piece of paper in every box. Yeah. Whereas like a Bayer microphone, you've got a graph that's printed out for that microphone.
Or a Sanken, or
a lot of. I mean, those two inexpensive dynamics off the top of my head. But.
Becoming the exception.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is.
Graphs are not always printed. Sometimes they've got Chinese people drawing them on the being.
Again, you can't. It's hard to account for.
The boss's kid was there. They're like, hey, play with it.
Right. And again, how much detail are they going to give you? I mean, like you're looking at mic preamps and you see the EIN, the noise figure.
Oh.
Well, if they tell you how they measure, how they got to that thing, was it with a
shorted input, 150, 600,
yeah. And if they don't say anything about it, if they just say that, it's probably the best case scenario, which is with a shorted input at a particular gain setting where it happens to do okay. And but if they tell you how they got that information and use reference comparisons that are industry standards that make sense, so you can actually make a direct comparison between two things, then at least you're dealing with somebody who is trying to be honest with you, or trying to give the impression of
The
being
language
honest
is
with you.
interesting. I think because something you can get hoodwinked pretty easily. Like the whole, what was it, Burger King? All the beef we use is 100% pure beef, but they don't tell you that the burgers are only 40% beef and then 60% soy. You know, and so if you're not thinking, if you're not approaching buying something with the opinion that you're going to get screwed, I think it's really easy to be like, well, it's 100% pure beef. Say, look, I saw 100%.
Right.
You know, I'm surprised too. There's someone downstairs selling microphones, and he's comparing microphones, and you get to listen to them in the headphones, and he's like, look at this one. Well, look at this one. This one sounds so much better.
Oh,
Like,
the
no,
Allen Sides method of comparison.
But it's so much. Well, no, it's 50 dB more gain on that one. Of course.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, they sound the same. Look.
You know, this goes back years. HDCD, when they were showing it, the comparison had 6 dB more gain for the HDCD choice. And it was outrageous. And they got busted pretty hard for it. Well, if we're talking about SM57s, look, there's probably an SM57 that does vary from the rest of them, and you've got it. And it's unique and idiosyncratic, and you got a special sound, and you can't have it. It's mine.
That goes back to the other thing. It's, and this is, I guess, more experience around microphones and recording situations. But like ribbon we have a lot of ribbon microphones at the studio, and those things, or at least the older Coles and RCA microphones, they get tired before they die completely.
Oh, and when they're starting to die,
Yeah.
especially in the case of Coles, you really have to know that sound because it's distortion.
And yeah, exactly. You got to be able to recognize it, and you also have to sort of remember. It's hard for people to remember how fragile these things are and how easy you can sort of just not destroy the mic. It's great if you ruin the ribbon. If you blow the ribbon, that's great because it's obvious and it doesn't work and it makes a crunk crunk when you move it, and
then you go get it fixed.
Yeah, and you can get it fixed. But the most annoying thing for me to deal with is just like these middle of the road microphones that have been, put a little too close to that huge metal guitar amplifier, or been put too close to the floor tom, or these things, and it stretches and flattens like the ribbon a little bit, and then like you end up with these microphones that are like halfway zones, and you don't find out.
It's a little funny, but you're not sure if you need to.
But the distortion in this one case sounded like crossover distortion. So we were looking for the problem in the mic pre.
Yeah.
Because how could that be the ribbon? That was a tough one.
I have like a love-hate relationship with the ribbons. Like if I didn't know this, I'd be sort of just like, I'll put it up there. It doesn't sound good. I'll put another one up there, a different type of microphone. It'll be great. Sometimes those mics sound great on this amp, but other times it must be the playing or something. It sounds awful.
Right. And then you walk around thinking that microphone's no good.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Like the
That's
tape
right.
machine. Like you think that's the sound of that microphone. It must be. And there are people with studios that have like a 74 RCA 74 that they've had for 5-10 years, and they haven't re-ribboned it.
77.
70. Well, we have the
44.
There's a 74 Junior guy.
Oh, that
which is like a. There's also.
It's fine.
70.
Yeah, I think
I
think it's
the Junior Velocity one, which sounds great. It has like a great fidelity to it, and when it's working and correctly, done. But it is like one of the more fragile ones, and it's it's like, oh, I saw this one ribbon being put like 6 inches away from the speaker cone. I can do this with the 74, and pretty soon.
But it's a lot more reliable than it used to be. I remember doing Herbie Mann, the flautist, and with the Reslow ribbon, and he walked up, and it's a live show, audience going crazy. He walked up, the very first thing he did was, and took the ribbon out. He was gone. The Reslows were really, really sensitive.
Then you got him with a blow dart, right?
Should have.
Oh! Sorry, show's over. He's got a sore throat.
We've made things more reliable by getting rid of the flautists. Probably the most prominent example that most people know about is how it's been kind of publicized that a lot of people walking around thinking that they know what a Neve 1073 sounds like with his high frequency ringing, because they took them out of the console and racked them up, and they didn't load the output transformer, and it rings, and it's got this bright thing happening, and
it has 40-year-old caps in it.
Right, which is a little different than
it's not just bright; it's sharp.
Right.
Yeah.
Knowing what that means is a good way to avoid that.
Exactly, and the same thing with, it's not so much these days because everybody knows the value of like an old Neumann tube microphone and the value of servicing it. But for a little while there, people would buy these old 47s, 48s, and they'd be like untouched since the day they were born, and like and they love that sound, but it's got about 50 years of like moist dirt caked on the capsule, and it's got like these maybe that. I don't know. Do they have those with
Or they've been
bypass?
serviced very poorly.
Yeah, serviced really poorly.
It's a VF-14 on its last leg.
Yeah, and it sounds nothing like it did the first day.
Yeah.
But again, they had that perception. Like I've worked in the studio. We had that thing for 10 years. I recorded everything with it. I know exactly what that sounds like, and like what that microphone sounded like, but it's not like a U48 or a U.
Well, the original U47s pretty much have all gone down. They had a polycarbonate diaphragm that before Mylar that was really unstable. So when you say that you had an original U47, you're
That's not
automatically lying, because all of those capsules went. We have a serial number 107, and it's been recapped several times. No way that's got an original capsule.
Right. And if it did, it would sound like
It would be up.
yeah. Like we only use it on kick drum and bass amplifiers.
That's funny. 47 FET on kick drum was always my favorite, but when you did that at Ocean Way, the seconds were instructed to put pop filters over them, because Alan, decided that he didn't want to. And of course, the first thing I do is take the pop filter off and take them. And it doesn't hurt the mic. It really doesn't. Those mics can take, Sherman tanks, or a whole Panzer division, to be more accurate. But you have to be careful.
Well, the flip side of the other voice, the completely opposite voice is just how it sounds. You know what I mean? Because we definitely have, there's one or two compressors we have that are definitely not set up properly. We have this multi-band compressor that was pulled from a radio station that's completely attenuates the bass, hypes the high end, and it's not set up properly. We have the manual to set it up, but as I was almost going to give it to our tech to calibrate, I ran a bass through it that had no tone to it. And it was the perfect thing for it. And so I think the flip side is just like, well, if it sounds right, then it's useful for that application.
Well, that's where distortion was born, was a broken input module on a console that was full of distortion, and it turned into fuzz tone. And maybe this is mythic.
And the world has never looked back.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're not trying to sell that on eBay, like working multi-band compressor. It's something that and
I just remember I was recording this woman, and she was friends with Rufus Wainwright, and Rufus came in to help sort of mix a song. And so there were 16 tracks, and I said to Rufus, do you want me to write down what the instruments are on the board or give you a track sheet? He's like, no. And he sat there for 2 hours, and he just did this. Like, do you want me to turn on that EQ? No. He didn't. I don't think he knew what anything did. And he tinkered and tinkered and tinkered. And I was like, Rufus, do you want a coffee? Coffee? You want a massage? Whatever, and some water. And I came back 3 hours.
You gotta be kidding.
I came back 3 hours later, and it sounded unbelievably great. And I don't think he knew literally what anything did other than maybe volume. And he sort of carved out, this arrangement sucked, and got rid of this and that. And it was this total
impulse
blind
mixing.
way of, and there was something to it, and I felt like, just to tap into some of that sometimes I think is valuable too, which is the complete antithesis of sort of this workshop in a way.
Right.
Well, what you were saying about left brain, right brain, I think it's important.
That was mine.
I do this, but was it?
Yep.
Okay, well, that's it.
Sorry,
Sorry.
it might have been in my mic.
Yeah. See, that you can never tell. But the thing about left brain, right brain, when we walk into the studio, I think it's important that we are right brain, that we're in the performance in the moment, and we're not thinking about, you mentioned it, not thinking about tweaking something beyond just basic limits. You don't want things to be terribly, you don't want a bass guitar to be terribly distorted if it's not supposed to be, or a vocal. But beyond that, we're really trying to just live in the performance and forget about this and choose on the basis of sound. I think you're absolutely right.
It's a lot easier to do that, though, when you've taken the time in advance before the band showed up to...
Good point.
You know what I mean? You spend
Make
your scientific hour beforehand and made sure that a bunch of stuff's not going to get in your way.
plus, you know, just you. This kind of it allows you to feel more free to do that. I don't know. I don't feel worried that like, you know, I don't feel that worried that something's gonna go wrong and ruin the session. It's kind of like a good thing, like to know that everything around you works well, and or at least if it doesn't work well, there's something right next to it that, you know, I can replace it for the instant. And you don't have to break the the momentum of like just creativity and recording, right?
I mean, you know what? I also will say that I think in every single instance when I've ever recorded a record that there's some audible problem, performance has always trumped that. You know,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, you got a little too
Absolutely.
close to the mic, you got a pop on the P.
Definitely.
Well, that performance, well, I'm not doing it again. Oh, you're right, let's just leave it.
See, I've had plenty where there's a problem, but the performance also sucked, so it's okay.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
Have you ever had these moments when you're like, oh, the piano just clipped, and you're hoping, like, for the next 2 minutes, make a mistake.
Right.
Make a mistake. Just make
exactly.
a mistake. I think you can do better.
Yeah.
Lower the gain on the pre.
For years of working with Ronstadt, she would look for those opportunities to humiliate me. And whenever there was distortion on the vocal, invariably, that's the one that she picked. And I say, but no, wait, we've got a much better one over here. I'd say, no, I like that one. You know, and that's the thing that went out. And I'll tell you, you really learn to anticipate when it comes on the radio so that you can sneeze and turn it down and nobody else will ever hear it. You know.
Who recorded that?
Who recorded it? Oh, I don't know, something.
I was recently doing overdubs like for this sort of punk band, and not really a punk band, but like it's a rock band, and sure enough, the guy had a cell phone in his pants, and you know, while he was playing his part, and like it had this
Singular, AT&T.
and he's like, "No, the guitar part's fine." I'm like, "Really? You can leave that on?" And like, you know, it's underneath a bed of like washy distortion or something, and like it was just when I soloed it to make sure that it, you know, we were listening for something, and I heard it, and it, I mean, I like the idea that there's a song with someone, you know, his wife with the kid calling him on the phone while he's doing the take, and
You almost done there?
it's like, listen, that's when you call me. It's like you can listen and hear. You can't hear it, but it's just funny.
iPhone on a Verimute is a surefire recipe for hearing that tone, that AT&T tone.
You're going to hear it in your studio no matter what. There's something in every studio there's lots of things in every studio that are going to pick up this stuff.
I put my phone like in the most equipmentless corner of the room. Just like I have it just like, I don't know, something about this phone. The Razor, like other people's Razors don't do it, but mine is just like loud. It's like an earlier version or something. I just like I toss it in the back corner by like the plant or the little, you know, the shoes or whatever, and I just let it sit there because, you know.
Right. But the band's not trained. They're going to forget and leave it in their pocket.
Yeah, the band, if it's a band's fault, I don't care. You know, it's like, hey, you know, why do you have
you
to
spoiled your own take. If you spoil
if I ruin the magic take with my phone making that noise, then I look like a dickhead.
Okay, I've got a favorite that's way off the radar that people don't pay a lot of attention to. For all of you guys with A to D converters, anybody use an A to D converter? Use A to D converters? Do you have a box? Maybe a box product? You know, maybe an Apogee or something, or put it in the control. MyTech maybe? Anybody got a MyTech? Put it in the control room. In the control room with you?
I don't actually.
Okay, but did anybody have their?
On stage.
Okay, well that's even worse.
That's even
Cool.
worse with people talking on their cell phones.
I'm not going there. It turns out the guy that helped co-engineer DSD, Ataka Nishio, showed me this. And I was measuring jitter with a Meitner box some years ago, and I was complaining about the jitter and something. He said, George-san, you need to learn something. And he turned up the monitors. He said, do you have any music on? And we were at the site in San Francisco, and cranked it up to not a very loud level, and the jitter went wild because of acoustic pickup in the crystal. And you know, we talk about jitter of this converter, jitter of that converter, jitter of that. Unless you really have an isolated crystal, and I don't mean just of an isolated, but away from acoustic source, that in not in all cases, but in many cases, is going to make your jitter worse. Just a little tidbit.
Jitter recovery, you don't think is a good cure for that? Because jitter
Well, there's good and bad jitter recovery. So it all depends. I mean, there's the thing that Thomas Lung did for TC, which is a 3-stage jitter thing to get good low jitter off of FireWire, which is not as deterministic as we'd like. And it's pretty good, but it's real expensive for MIPS. A lot of people don't want to do that. So I don't think you can count on jitter recovery, is my opinion.
Your source clock normally, it's not.
Well, it's not always, but I mean, when you have, like on stage, are you tied into a word clock on stage? I don't think so.
You have multiple converters,
You have to,
So yes,
on stage.
you have to.
Yeah, but you have multiple converters.
Multiple converters on stage all have the same protocol. So you have to, otherwise.
But that's you're pretty sophisticated. I mean, you know, sophisticated user carrying around RG59U to a gig.
Why not? It's yes, why not?
And-
That's part of the studio, right?
Yeah,
Period.
yeah.
And there's stuff that's a good example of something just like brand new that I wouldn't even think of. It's obviously there's stuff out there, little anecdote stuff like that you learn and you know, for me, I think like, oh, I kind of think I have all the analog side
Right.
of things down, and like this digital world, like, you know, I kind of just have to trust what's in the box, and I don't want to like go to EE school to learn all the digital, like this,
Right.
everything
Like
that I need to know about that. But things like that are just common sense sort of things of the future, you know.
Of the
Like,
future.
of course, you're not going to put your speakers on top of the converters, you know.
Right. Well, I thought, you know, I mean, I've had the experience when the speakers are feeding back with the spring reverb, and it can actually sound really cool sometimes. But I thought if you're using a digital reverb, you're not gonna. I would have thought of that.
There was.
As long as you isolate your clock, you should be good if you have a separate clock,
I found that if you just get it out of the room,
both the converters and
uh,
Or just the clock.
just the clock.
Just the clock.
Yeah. I mean, for that one thing, yeah.
Mhm.
But I mean, we haven't even talked about microphone cables and microphonics. That a lot of microphone cables you run into are microphonic.
Of course, we're kind of getting to the point where, again, the performance isn't really what we're talking about now. We're talking almost so far to the technical side.
Yeah.
Most of the time, the performance is going to trump anything we are concerned about.
Absolutely, without a shadow of doubt. And that's not to say that you wouldn't prefer the microphonics in the microphone
Right.
cable. That's part of the sound. But I think it's just being aware of it, that it could happen, so that if ever crops up and you don't want it, or you do want it, that you're in charge.
And there's definitely like that limit that you learn to put on yourself on what you should care about and what you shouldn't care about.
Right.
Like, you know, there's
The
so many,
structure, yeah.
like, you know, there's so many times where we use microphones that aren't on suspensions, you know, mounts, and like there are these really nice microphones, and they, you know, were sold with these suspension mounts, but you know, you can get away with not using, you know, for a drum kit where you're thumping the floor around and
But now, that is a problem, because some of these cheaper stands resonate.
Yeah.
You know, you get
Oh,
a
yeah.
tone that goes right up to the mic.
Mhm.
But if it's in key.
is there a couple more resources, like to get started, a couple more books or websites that you could give us?
Yeah.
If you, yeah, go. If you, it totally depends on what you're curious about, and like if you're
Right.
curious about learning about maintenance for
Electronic theory, or it depends what you want to know. But I mean,
Yes.
Yes.
what do you want? Like I said, Jensen Transformers website, Rain's website, Symmetrix' website's got some cool stuff.
That Audiocyclopedia is a good. You buy it. It's like an encyclopedia. You don't have to you don't have to read the whole thing to get into it. You just look up the thing. You're kind of op amps. What are they like? And you look, and there's like a nice big section on op amps, and then it starts from scratch basically on every chapter, describing the basic nature of things, and you know, and that's like a good sort of quick reference book. And
About 10 years ago, I just went to the bookstore in the shopping mall and found like a clearance, just basic electronics textbook. And this is before I knew anything about, you know, about real electronics. And I read through it, and it was pretty basic, and I still didn't understand any of it. You know, it's like but they started at the, you know, silicon level of explaining how a transistor works and how a diode works and how a PN junction works. And if you if you start at that level, like I said, some of it's kind of dry and you might not be interested in knowing it on that level, but it really helps you understand exactly. It helps you remember other things about it. You know, why an NPN transistor has to be, has to have the voltage on that end instead of the other end, and
like that getting started in electronics Radio
right.
Shack book.
Actually, yeah, there's very few things I recommend from Radio Shack. Like generally, there's no reason to go in there because every time you do the one thing you thought they still had is gone now. But they have a book about power supplies, and it's actually pretty good. It explains how you figure out what AC voltage you need to get this DC voltage and different rectifier topologies, and it kind of gives you some practice applying Ohm's law, which is the first place to start, of course.
If you're in Los Angeles, there's a bookstore opposite the record plant called, and it's still there, isn't it? Op Amp Labs? It's a regular bookstore, and they've got everything. And you can generally talk to the guy behind the counter and say, well, I'm interested in tubes or whatever, and he'll come up with something.
Tell him George sent you.
Right.
And he'll throw you out. But there's another thing I wanted to mention is for years, the semiconductor manufacturers that did ICs put out, especially National, put out these great, and it was Bob Williams, who's now at LT, I think, put out these great reference books on how to build an IC-based power supply. And it was a tutorial in how to use general purpose chips and some of their chips. And all of us that ever looked in those manuals, in the early Fairchild manual, learned how to start out with ICs looking at the suggested circuits in the back. A little less so these days, but those books are still around. There's one book in particular, though, that we've never seen anywhere else, and that was a National Semiconductor Process book on transistors and FETs, giving you the general process number and all the transistors that were selected out of that. I don't know whether you ever saw it, but from small to large signal,
National's great. They are really good.
The
at
actual
giving you
architecture of the chip, the monolithic chip for both FETs, and you realized how small the linear transistor business really was. It was really only one or two parts and thousands of selections for different parameters. And you can't find that book anymore.
But you can find things like IC op amp applications. Free books that like National will just send you if you just ask for it.
It's a real resource. We're later in technology.
Yeah.
Sorry, Justin George, but the that Corp stuff is great.
Yeah, that Corp.
The Corp with their chips, and they've also got some great application data and documents.
Yeah.
On a practical level, I know that Greg's there. Kind of visited in the past, I think you as well, but the group DIY or the Project Pro forum is great.
Even like Gear Sluts and these online forums that have like the little geek corner.
Yeah.
And you can go in and ask a question. And I'm on there a lot trying to answer people's questions, and sometimes I learn even just by answering them because I'm like, I never really thought about it, and you got to, But Bill Whitlock has done work with both Jensen. He's the head of Jensen, but he was doing some work with that corporation to do their ingenious chips. And he gave a talk at AES last time it was in San Francisco, and it was just amazing. It was like I came to understand balanced interfacing better than I ever had before because he was so good at explaining it. And he had this PowerPoint presentation, and this is really cool. I've actually got a printout out of here, but he has this little cartoon of worms getting electrocuted. Because people want to have their own ground in the studio, then have it separate from the one at the panel, your power line safety ground, and that's a really bad idea. And understanding why that's a bad idea is really important.
Yeah.
Right. Well, because of Ohm's law.
Have nothing
that's
to
where
fish
you
with.
start. But before we, in my little bit of preparation, I emailed him and said, "Can I get that stuff?" And he emailed me these two really big PDFs, and I have it on my computer here. So when we're done, anybody who wants me to email it to you right now, I can. So.
Yeah, definitely.
Or just call up Bill Whitlock and ask him.
Those are good. Those forums are a good sort of place to go because usually, not everybody's generous with information, but a lot of people are. I mean, some of them, like I'm kind of when I go on a group DIY message board, I get like. Intimidated by just the sheer size of what's going on there. I'm like, oh man, there's like 73 pages on how to make an 1176. I was like, I'd rather just try it myself and then use a search function later on. It's like, I don't know.
The metas are a great place to start. I run some of them for people, and I'm one of the people that hang out there and give back, for what I've been given. metas, if you go to that group DIY, right at the top it says meta, and it's chronologically ordered by project type, by electronic basics. So if there's something for everyone, whether you don't even know what a resistor is or what it does, you can learn that too. You know, kind of finding out, you know, noise floor ratio of, you know, Allen Bradley resistors, you know, kind of like, you know, strange thing, the demonic stuff that happened. So there's something for everybody.
Right.
So, but if you start there, because otherwise it's overwhelming.
Right, yeah.
There's thousands of people with some who know nothing, and don't just jump on the board and say, like, how do I build this?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like,
It's like a pet peeve of everybody.
can I get I want to build a Neve preamp. How do
I really think that Wikipedia is a great resource because it's so peer-reviewed and they really work pretty hard on making things, laying things out in a way that is useful to everybody. And so, I find, unfortunately, the problem is there's so many links to other things you'll end up reading about, you know,
pigs,
World War I history or something like that, you know. But like right now, I'm looking at the page for Ohm's law, and it's like it's this big long page, and the top paragraph is the basics. And you read that, and if you don't understand it, then you don't need to go past the little table of contents that goes into the detail. But start with the top, and there's some links to, you know, it's like it talks about the relationship between volts and amps and ohms. And if you don't know what those are, there's links to them, so then you can read about them. You know, everything you want to know is in there.
There are only a few things that you really need some kind of expert over your shoulder to say, well done, or that's wrong. And one of them is soldering.
Yeah.
When you really are doing it right and you have a firm joint or a cold solder joint. And it really is an art. It's an art.
But it's something that you pick up fairly quickly if you have some
pick it
help,
up.
and then you just get better at it with your practice.
That's the thing that was key for me, was having like a really anal retentive Danish smart guy who was like the tech at our studio when we first started out, and he had these like, and it was a good sort of like educator, alpha male type personality who, you know, like would set up these, and you know, like, you want to wire some cables, and I'd be like, yeah, I want to wire some cables. All right. And he like built this little box, and then hammered nails into the box, and then made like these wire, you know, crisscrosses with these wire. All right, like solder these pieces of wire together. Like spent like half an hour just, you know, doing this little exercise, and then they would criticize me on, you know, cold solder joints and like this, and but it was like perfect. Like from that point on, didn't have to like, I didn't worry about it. Like I didn't have to think about it as being a problem. You know, you get both pieces of metal hot, and you know, use like the solder as almost a conductor of heat for, you know.
And do it fast. Get in and out.
Exactly, really quickly, and that was key. Like, you know, it's so good to have people. If you can find a person who doesn't get annoyed with you asking questions, and he's sort of like free with his information, and if you're helping that person, usually they'll help you back, and it's like, it'd be good to sort of spend a week.
The nice thing is that engineers and like really technical people, like, they can't talk to their wives about this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, like there's a lot of people who you can't talk to about it. So if someone comes to you and like wants to ask you some questions about your knowledge, you're like, oh, I can have a conversation now instead of just talking to myself. Yeah. So it's really, I found it's very easy to find people who are willing to share their information and teach me stuff. And I've found it even easier to find other people who want to know the little bit of information that I have. So, yeah, people.
Definitely, yeah, that human element, at least for me, I mean, some people are different, but the human element of, like, you know, sitting next to a person and learning that way, like, I don't know if I would have done as well if I had to do it online or something, and maybe when there are more videos and stuff of, you know, ABC.
Oh, one other thing that's really cool, speaking of online, once you get past that point and you're ready to kind of maybe go to the next step, we were talking about how MIT has online classes available that you can actually get for free from iTunes.
That's great.
And I've seen it, I haven't read any of it yet, but that's really cool that you can basically take a class at MIT on iTunes.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, not even, you know, even on
free.
YouTube.
Yeah.
It's like on YouTube,
Wow.
I took a class, or I didn't take a class, but I was like watching, while I was doing some mindless soldering, I was watching a class on the lymphatic system taught by, you know, Berkeley, you know, University. Like,
Yeah.
Great.
It's like, oh, that's, you know, spleen, the lymphocytes, and I wanted to like do something.
You wanted to operate.
Yes, I wanted to cut like an animal open and see it for real. Because you got to get your hands in there and do it. You know?
Yeah, cool.
They make so much money. But anyone else have any sort of curiosities of stuff? How's
If you want to get really inspired about doing stuff yourself, there's this video on Make Magazine's website of a guy. I think he's a German guy or something, some European guy, but it's a video of a guy in his own little shop with some fairly basic shop tools, making his own vacuum tube and then powering it up and
Did you see
running
this?
through-
Wow.
It's really entertaining and he what's that?
What magazine?
It was Make Magazine, but it's I don't know it's
Search on YouTube for making it, hand making it.
it's maybe we should have plugged in the monitor. But,
You could go to full screen.
maybe.
There's also a great one on how to make a little laser out of a DVD recorder, like an old, computer DVD recorder. You make a little.
You seen that one?
No.
How to make a speaker out of a paper plate with penny?
No.
Oh, that's very good. It doesn't work very well.
I can't wait for the YouTube how to make gold
So
out
much
of
for the,
shoes. Other like other sessions, like moments where you definitely dodged a huge show-stopping bullet without having the clients know about it, and this could have really ruined our plans, that sort of thing. Is there I know over the years you've been in plenty of sessions, and it's had to have come up somehow, where everybody flies in for the one day or something, and
Most recently, I did, and I've got a video of it, of my producing partner, John Randall, doing his song at Capitol Studios, and I was doing it for BMG, and I was going to blow $22,000 in 3 hours, flying him in, triple scale musicians, live in the room, him singing live with string players, so it's one time only.
wow.
And 5 minutes before downbeat, one of the 4 Sanken CO100Ks goes, and it's gone. And that's 5 minutes before downbeat, and the whole point of this was to get a surround sound field. So that was the surround sound field. And without a schematic and without any idea of what we were doing, a guy who I had worked with for years tore into this microphone and just poked around and tried to figure it out. I don't know what the hell we did, but it started working again right at downbeat. But that would have brought the session down. It would have been a distinctly different deal without that microphone. And that's happened. And live, going out live with the I used to go out with the Hiders guys, Bill Yodelman and those guys. It would happen every time. I remember doing Little Feet at the Rainbow when, again, 5 minutes before. It always happens 5 minutes before I hear.
Oh, yeah.
The old MM1100, the meter bus power also powered the changeover relay. And we had 1 meter light bulb that had shorted out, and we couldn't get the machine in to record. And we had to rip this thing apart in 5 minutes before downbeat. Fix it. That seemed to happen less these days, but it used to happen all the time.
The technician at our studio, Garfield, who started building radio stations, would then be on call on the radio stations, and he was telling me that they have to repair the console while it's still going to air.
Yeah.
So if something goes out, you have to figure out.
Right. I don't have a good anecdote off the top of my head, but like I said, I was learning recording doing live bands on the radio where, the announcer's in the other room and he says, here's the band, and if there's a problem right then, you have to fix it really fast. It's a good way to learn how to deal with that kind of pressure. But and you are forced to just deal with it and learn signal path and figure out how to get around it and, switch to the channel of the Neve that's not dead and,
Years ago, some of you remember this, or maybe not, there was a presidential debate, and Lynn, you'll remember this, that a capacitor blew up in a line driver, and it went completely dead for 18 minutes of network time with, could it have been Carter and Ford, something like that, and 18 minutes of dead air on the network. And the minute it went, I knew it was a power capacitor because of that sound. And it turns out that that's what it was, but they couldn't fix it. And I'm trying to wonder what kind of idiots wouldn't have a cool tech out there that could do a fast workaround, but they couldn't fix it. Well, it was I'm talking about from the audio truck to the video truck, that kind of thing. Somebody didn't throw a 100-foot cable out and just patch around it.
Right.
Nobody.
But for a presidential debate, they should get a guy who knows to come
They
out.
should have figured it out. Yeah, they should figure it out. Somebody got fired on
I
that.
think it was Carter.
I know in my world, in a 24-track, 2-inch tape machine world, you need a spare machine. You need a parts machine, and that will save your ass. Just as far as dodging bullets, just having that
Spare set of cards for the MCI.
Yeah.
You have to.
Yeah.
Except for when the spare set is bad, then you're in trouble.
Then you're in trouble. Yeah. Yeah. If you bought both machines and they're both beaten up, then.
Although, I mean, that's why you have a 16-track machine. It's like if all 16 channels worked, you'd have room for that tambourine overdub that would have ruined the record. So 14 is better.
Exactly. But it buys you the day and a half to get the component and all that sort of stuff.
It'll pay for itself. A parts machine will pay for itself in
Yeah.
the amount of time you won't have downtime at
Right.
the studio.
A parts machine costs a whole lot less than all the parts in it.
Yeah.
Especially this thing. Everybody see the picture of the Mitsubishi X850 at Primal? The guys turned it into a cooler, a beer cooler. It pops the top.
I mean, I would never do this to one of these machines, but like the ATR 102 is like perfect, like for a DJ like console, like a DJ 212-inch,
Oh, right.
you have like turntables right there, a little like a mixer thing right there, and you have the meters which you can turn around maybe.
Crossfader where the head stack used to be.
Exactly. Exactly.
But it's funny.
It's a total nightmare, but it's when I walk up to him, it's like someone's gonna do this at some point.
Right.
It's funny you talk about that Mitsubishi machine because I think, every AAS show, every exhibitor comes out with this is the latest and greatest. These are their blackface ADATs. You can record 16-bit digital audio on a VHS
Perfect
tape.
sound forever.
And it's interesting to have the 20/20 hindsight to go. As a gear acquisition person, dodge that bullet at that 18,000 useless dollars.
Or not.
Yeah, or not. Or I should have bought the X over Y.
I'm an early adopter, and it has served me not well, but it has served me because there's something. I mean, I always go in with beta software. I'm not bragging, because there's something about if it's really stable and it's really reliable, it's also really obsolete. The really stable Pro Tools is the one that's really obsolete. I'm sorry. I'm going to go in with beta software, even if it crashes in the middle of a tape from time to time. Because I've got that many more. Well, also, it keeps me on my feet.
Isn't that why it's obsolete, though? I mean, it's stable and nobody needs to buy a new one. Oh, we better make a new one.
Ooh, I hadn't
So that
thought
you
of
can
it.
buy
I
it
would
again.
never do that. I never thought of it. Never thought about it that way.
Yeah, I'm curious if it's going to slow down a bit because right now, like, you can pretty much if you had 20 or 30 grand, you can buy a recorder or a DAW that'll serve you for as long as the computer is going to be supported.
Right. What's going to happen to the industry when computers get fast enough for everything and you don't need a new one ever again?
Exactly, and we don't need to go.
Right.
Exactly.
That uses more processing power, and then you have to get a faster computer.
But that's the thing. It's like, are we running out of processor power? Are we running out of room? Are we, we've hit kind of like the plains. We're out of the Rockies and we're in the plains now. It's like how can we complicate ourselves more? Like
Right.
we're just gonna make.
We're going to get more complex graphical interfaces, or just something to eat up processing power.
Yeah, like contact lens displays.
Higher sampling rates, something to waste this extra processing power we've got.
But yeah, also like I always thought that the next step for just computers is like once you had the speed and the power and the room and the space, like then people will start trying to build tanks. Like they'll try to build like this computer that their advertising will last you 30 years. All that sort of stuff. And like I don't think it actually happened, but
Well, my answer to that is that I'm still short on DSP to do functions that are really analog-like.
Yeah.
I mean, the new compressor I've been working on upsamples to 192 and does all the sidechain work at 192.
Oh, okay.
And now I've really started to hear analog response in the sidechain. Well, if I hear a little bit of improvement in that direction, I'm thinking to myself, well, why not 384?
Yeah.
You know,
Run it
and
up.
so as soon as processing is available, I soak it up. You know, so sorry.
That's fine. I'll just use the real compressor in the physical world.
That's
You're-
yeah, but you see, that's too reliable.
Yeah.
That's old-fashioned.
Yeah, like yours works fine. Just stick with that one, the physical one.
I can't argue with that.
It does take a lot of, we probably paid $3 a year on powering it. Yeah, we could save some money if we turned it off and used the DSP.
Don't do that.
Yeah, then all the lead from it will pollute our water table.
That's right. Well, cool.
Anyone else, any questions before we adjourn? Anyone have anything they want to build after this neat discussion? I want to build myself a boat for my studio. Is there like a link on the DIY site, the group DIY site on that kayak?
No, but there was one funny. Someone was saying they were building a gate, and it was quite literally a gate for their house. It's like different kind of DIY. Like a brewery's great to hang out. Like if you just want to just meet people, and someone's like, check out my new gate. You go inside, and it's a physical wooden kind of thing.
Great. Great.
What's the threshold adjustment on that?
Is there any big chunk of information still missing for anybody? Mentioned Ohm's law a few times. Anybody not know what that is? Oh, good.
All right.
I think our job is done.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks. Cheers.